Habari gani, karibuni, asanteni for being here with us. Kumbukeni community, we welcome you. Today we're going to have a very interesting and inspiring conversation on one of our brothers, on our community in South Africa. My name is Nduku Mulumba. I am one of the co-hosts on Kumbukeni. I am a Black woman who is fed up with the imperialist system and its atrocities that it carries out on our people all over the globe. And I have decided to do something about it with my comrades. Brother Milton, Brother Adesoji, if you can please introduce yourselves.
Yes, karibuni, comrades, sisters and brothers from all over the global Pan-African community. Milton Allimadi from New York City, part of this global university, our online university, where we combine remembrance, Kumbukeni, our past, our history, and explore how to resolve some of the contemporary challenges using the wisdom of our great Pan-African ancestors. So welcome to today's conversation. Karibu.
Yes, Ekudede we, as we would say in Yoruba, and yes, reaching you all from the capital of the Imperial Empire, the one and only. Exactly, the one and only, the one that gave us the language we're about to start conversing in.
Which is about to change very soon.
And land of Shakespeare, land of Charles Dickens, and needless as I say, the land of George Orwell,
Yes.
1984. So, and Animal Farm.
Yeah.
I will not say the names of oppressors, but keep going.
Aren't we all living on a global animal farm? And yes, we're here gathered to discuss today another interesting topic. Thank you all for coming in, and over to you, sis.
All right. We're going to be speaking about the economic freedom fighters. Yes, you heard that right, economic freedom fighters. And it's been a pleasure reading and looking into the EFF, the South African EFF. But I will let you all know that it's not limited to the South African borders, which will be part of our conversation. So, brothers, let's start with the beginning of the EFF, when they formed and why they formed. So we all know that, at least the three of us know, that they formed in 2013. Why do you think they came in power? And why are they getting so popular? Because their popularity has grown since.
Well, they're not in power yet, but they're on their way.
Well, they are in power. They're not in governmental power, but they are in power. But go on.
Right, so the story in South Africa is really the same story that we are facing everywhere, including right here in the United States. How to create much more equitable societies, right? Where the wealth, the income, opportunities, resources are much more equitably distributed. And I think the more we see it that way, the more we can actually, as Rodney said, right? You have to pose the right questions.
Yep.
And these are some of the questions that we face collectively, and we can explore common solutions. And that's why we are discussing the EFF today, the Economic Freedom Fighters. They emerge because these issues, even much more so in the United States, are much more acute in South Africa. It is hard to believe, but South Africa actually has the most skewed income and wealth distribution in the world, worse even than in the United States. They have an economic term called the Gini coefficient to measure the inequality. It's a complicated terminology, so there's no need to go into it. But South Africa has the highest index, which is like 63, compared to the United States, which, for example, is 45 or so. In South Africa, the top 20% control 70% of the income. In South Africa, in 2022, the unemployment rate for European South Africans was 8%, and they make up 8% of the population. For the African population, who make up 80% of the population, the unemployment was 37%. Just think about that. 37% in South Africa. The white income, average income, is 3 times more than that of Africans, average income.
And they are the minority.
The average income of the European population is actually higher than the average income of European Americans. In South Africa, where the European population is, as I said, 8%, they still control 72% of the fertile arable farming land. So if you look at it, it's quite obvious that the struggle against apartheid continues. There are two struggles going on in South Africa. One is to continue the dismantling of apartheid. We have the superficial apartheid is gone in the sense that we have now an African president. But the essential foundation of apartheid, which is the economic base, has not changed. And that is where the EFF comes into the picture. Steve Biko warned in an interview in 1976, I believe, which is on YouTube. Anybody who is interested can go on YouTube and search for Steve Biko interview. It's about a 24-minute interview, either 76, 77, shortly before he was killed. And Biko said, if in South Africa we have only a replacement of the European rulers with Africans, and then it stops at that, then it would be as if apartheid never ended. So what we have is the EFF is continuing the struggle, and now the struggle is essentially against the ANC or elements of the ANC which have been co-opted, including the top leadership, of course, including the president of the ANC himself, who is the president of the country, Ramaphosa, Cyril. I cannot imagine what Mandela, and of course, this would not happen if Mandela was still alive, but then it means he does not even respect the legacy and memory of Mandela. That a president of a country could be exposed at having stitched $4 million in cash in a sofa found in his private farm, mafia style. Just think about that. So this just gives you a picture of why it was inevitable that a party like the Economic Freedom Fighters would emerge. The conditions were ripe for it. They continued the legacy of the original ANC with the Freedom Charter. They continued the legacy of Robert Sobukwe, of Steve Biko, and Winnie Mandela, others who wanted the total liberation of South Africa from apartheid. Thank you.
Yeah. Brother Adesoji.
I would come from the angle of women. More than 60% of the working population of South Africa are women, and mostly are domestic workers. They have no rights. They have no access to benefits. Julius Malema is a product of one. His grandmother was also a domestic worker. His mom was also a domestic worker. And so he would have gone through all of that pain to see that this is not, aside from the overarching atmosphere of living under apartheid and what have you, but the 21 years since, I would say now, going old 30 years since ANC has been in power, has been one of unmitigated disasters. And as we also mark the passing of one of Africa's greatest writers, in the person of Misero Gitemugo, who passed on June 30, 2023, when she said, "Speaking my mind, one of the questions that is often not spoken out loud is the fact that for how long would women continue to endure this?" I mean, she also follows on from someone who passed exactly 30 days before her, Ama Aita Ado, who also says, "Since we've known the Europeans, all they have been doing is taking, taking, and taking. So when do you then realize that what the EFF stands for, which is not just anti-imperialism, it's also the asking of basic essentials, basic essentials. So when they formed in 2013, people considered them to be a joke. In 2014, they stood for the general election. They got 6%. But in 2019, they got 11%. So they went from 24 seats in the National Assembly to 44 seats in the subsequent election. So one could see that there's a projection, there's a growing trajectory on the path they've chosen. And so it would be remiss of us to think that is not a model that can be taken on by every other person within the African sphere. But as we all see, it's currently going on in Burkina Faso and Mali. And so, that model, the EFF, that is the Economic Freedom Fighters, is going to be a model that is going to be embraced by places that at the moment might not seem to be on our radar, but we watch this space.
Yeah. And he specifically, we put the link to the speech that's going to be the main focus of our conversation today that he presented at Oxford in the UK. That's 7 years after they formed. That is 2010. It was yes, 2010, right? At Oxford, and
2015.
2015, and most of our conversation will be going to that. So it's at the beginning of the comments. He also says that they formed the EFF to reject the false notion of white supremacy, because in South Africa you have that going on very much. Colorism is a big deal. He talks about even the black elite who are trying to accommodate white supremacy and provide comfort for them are using their black skin. They're taking advantage of that colorism to be gatekeepers there. So he also talks about the dumping of low-grade food from foreign countries in South Africa. That was another reason why they were formed. And he also talks about the mineral resources in South Africa and how they benefit only the wealthy. It's a conglomerate of organizations from the West and from the US, from foreign nations that are benefiting from the mineral resources in South Africa while the workers are suffering. He gives an example of London Mines, which is located right next to a small town of South Africans. And he juxtaposes them where he says at the London Mines, they have electricity and water and all kinds of resources, but the small town right next to them does not have any of those resources. And that just goes to show these are the residents of that nation, and you are an invader, and you're coming now and building all these resources and not providing for them. So there was a need for a movement by the people to stand up against that, and therefore the EFF. What is the impact so far of the EFF in South Africa, brothers? We can start with you, Adesoji. I mean, if you want to.
Well, what's it called? The town you refer to is Marikana, and I think in 2017 that's when the killing of 39 miners for asking for a living wage happened. And as he rightly noted, it was the fact that here was a resource that was being exploited. And what he spoke to there is history for those who are still very much aware, because Kwame Nkrumah mentioned it in his book, the last stage, neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, that the African continent has basically been carved up into commercial estates. So you have somebody exploiting coal, somebody exploiting oil, some people diamond, and what have you. So this London mines is essentially just carrying on the legacy of what has transpired before. And so it's important that in the vacuum created by the fact that ANC, being the party in government, feeling beholden to this commercial interest, would not seek to rock the boat. And then the only facing that ANC has was on his right side, which is essentially trying to say, justifying its position in government by saying, I am anti what you are, which is you are pro apartheid, we are not. Not looking at the provision of what needs to be done with regards to the provision of quality education, basic amenities, a living wage, health facilities, and what have you. So when EFF came in 2013, they came exactly to fit in into that vacuum. How have they done? Well, the electoral victories, somewhat would suggest that they've struck the right chord with regards to the masses. They are saying what the masses are saying, what the masses need to hear, and not just need to hear, actually, saying it in such a way that even to their diehard critic, it is difficult to dismiss offhand, to say, oh, what you're asking for is unreasonable. Because none of their, I mean, the notion that one less than 5% of the population would hold more than 70% of the arable land in the country, devoiding people of the means or the access to land so that they can feed themselves and also, build wealth based on that access to land, is nonsensical. It just doesn't make sense. So it's not unreasonable to ask such a question. And they're asking reasonable questions. And so it is that reasonability that has endeared them to the generality of people, not just within South Africa, but also outside of South Africa. Because, we're talking about the EFF now. So it goes to show that not only the world is sitting and taking notice, people are actually, embracing the ideology to say, listen, it is 2023. Things needs to change. So yeah, the coming of the EFF is not a day too late. If I could say, there's a question of why have many others not copied that model? That would be the
Exactly.
question.
Exactly. Brother Milton.
Yes. Just a quick point. I think Maracana was in August 2012.
2012, yeah.
Right. And what I like most about the EFF is that, especially the Oxford Union debate lecture, rather,
Mm-hmm.
I like the way he combines the class critique, you know, because that's often where we let our own compradors,
Mhm.
our own agents of imperialism who are African, get
Mm-hmm.
away when we only focus on the white elite or white supremacy. So he combines it in a really brilliant way in that lecture. Because after all, the Maracana massacre, for example, and one can say, yes, maybe it's the white power structure using him, but at the end of the day, he's still an African.
Mm-hmm.
Cyril Ramaphosa, he was a member of the board of the London
The
London Mines.
mines. Mm-hmm.
London.
Mhm.
And apparently he was the one that actually uh, pushed for the police intervention, which of course turned out to be a violent intervention. And, all those people were massacred. And I think a couple of months ago, when I was trying to follow up the reading it turns out that many of them have not yet been compensated, even though their families were promised, compensation. So that's not happened. So one of the questions you posed was, what have they accomplished so far? And in addition to the points that Brother Adesoji outlined, the fact that the ANC is now talking about land reform as well is because of the EFF.
The pressure.
And they've always pressed for this in Parliament. And the question they posed was that, why should we be talking about compensation for the land? We are talking expropriation without compensation. Because, as he also repeated in the Oxford Union lecture, the land was acquired through genocide of Africans who were ethnically cleansed and displaced from the land. So, as he also said in the lecture, the Oxford lecture, what prevailed at some point was essentially the parties that represented, the former parties that represented the interest of the European population, very right wing, but the ANC had also drifted right wing and left this space, a vacuum. And as you put it, whenever you have a vacuum, it's going to be filled with matter. And that's hence the birth of the EFF. And he said before the EFF, nobody was addressing the interest of the working class, of the marginalized, the low income, the unemployed, the mine workers, the students. And he gave examples that are really hard to forget. He said, for example, the employees that work in the universities are not actually on staff. They are assigned to those universities by labor brokers. In this country, there would be, I guess, like temp agencies.
That reminded me of Robert Sobukwe as I listened to that. But go on, brother.
Yeah. And he said some of them work at the same job for 30 years without benefit. So they have no health insurance. They have no retirement money. After 30 years, when they let go, or when they retire with nothing. It's as if the same day that they started that job. So, of course, this is outrageous. And then he gave the other example, which, of course, also applies here, actually, in the United States, that the wealthy South Africans have health insurance coverage for their pets.
For their dogs.
Right. Well, these employees at the universities, not really employees, let's call them workers, right? Because that's what they are, workers at the universities. Gas station attendants, they call it petrol station. South Africa, as with other African countries.
He said they're called labor brokers.
So the labor brokers are the ones that
hire them
to these locations.
Okay.
But once they get there, they have no benefits and they have no health insurance. So I think that, of course, is something that resonates even right here in the United States. And that's why I say at the end of the day, it's a struggle against a global elite that monopolize wealth and income. And then the rest of you, well, you live on the crumbs that are left on the table.
Yes.
If South Africa can at the end have a party like the EFF, it raises the question, why can't a party like the EFF emerge in the United States? In fact, it should. Because as Julius Nyerere famously said, the late Julius Nyerere, president of Tanzania, the world would be a much, much better place if the United States had a true opposition party. He said the problem is that the Democrats and the Republicans are both capitalists and both imperialists.
Kabisa.
So even people here in the United States should take lessons from the EFF
EFF.
and Julius Malema and his comrades.
At the risk of criticism, which I do not mind inviting, because I have realized if human beings, as it's told in the stories in the Bible, killed Jesus, who am I to think that they won't be coming for me? So I will say that in the United States, there are movements that have risen up, just like the EFF. But the United States is very strategic at labeling these individuals and these groups and these organizations as terrorists. So this is what's going on in the United States, and the Black people, I don't know how we're going to figure out how to navigate that, but we need to do that.
It can be done.
As you're speaking of that, it reminds me of the conference we attended last week with the community movement builders. They hosted it. There were several Black organizations who are pursuing liberation of Black people globally. And we know one of the organizations, the Uhuru Movement, has been recently indicted by one of the government factions. And so this is the threat that Black movements in the United States is facing. And we have to be realistic about it when we ask these questions. Why are people in the United States not doing anything about it? We truly have to be realistic about the force that they're facing that's hindering them from doing it.
I think we should see it, as I said in the beginning, much more of a class struggle. If we see it that way, we can build an alliance which can easily challenge the monopoly that is currently exercised by both the Democrats and the Republican Party, who are both actually essentially hostile to the working class communities.
Right.
True.
Yeah.
Working class Latinos who can form alliances with working class African descendants in this country,
Right.
including Caribbeans, including recent African immigrants who have become citizens that can vote in this country, including working class Europeans that are conscious. Such a party would be much, much more beneficial than the current Republican and Democratic parties. I see no reason why these groups and organizations should not call a national conference at some point in the future and just form this party and not allow the tyranny of capital and finance capital to be imposed over the country through their representatives in the Democratic and the Republican Party.
Adesoji, you have something to say about that?
In writing Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, I believe it's the first chapter. Nkrumah says the world going forward should be mindful of the fact that you're not fighting countries, you're fighting commercial interests.
Right, that's in the introduction.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we get lost in the sauce when we start using labels of who is a Democrat, who is a Republican. You're fighting commercial interest. End of. It doesn't matter who is there. It's even in the UK here, you have the Labour Party, you have the Conservative Party. Birds of the same feathers of wings of the same bird.
Birds of the same feather, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Being wings of the same bird. So you're fighting commercial interest. And so it goes back to what he spoke to, what Sankara spoke to, what what's his name? The gentleman we spoke about last week, Gaddafi was recently killed for. This concept of you lack no agency in deciding your own fate. So I don't think it's so much as staring at them, but to quote the words of another brother, Kwame Ture, who says, organize, organize, organize. Once you do that, they have no recourse than to either show their hand in the most brutal form possible. Example is what is happening in France, or negotiate. Again, Malema said something in that video there, which was the fact that even when they won, they were still conciliatory towards the defeated. That is something they don't do. Maybe that is where the tactics needs to change. That if you win, like my brother, what's his name? The Cape Verdean revolutionary.
Amilcar Cabral.
Yes, it will say, "Claim no easy victories. Tell the truth, and let the truth be your battering ram." You need to speak to them to let them understand that, listen, this is the cost of our victory. The people are going to have a reasonable way of living. The EFF in itself will not have come into the fore, whereas when South Africa won, when the ANC won the election, or in the course of winning that election, on the negotiation table, they had said the issue of land distribution is non-negotiable. If you had said that, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion today. There probably won't be a vacuum for the EFF to fill. So again, in that video, it mentioned the fact that mistakes have been made elsewhere. Zimbabwe was an example used. But the question with Zimbabwe was, it wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. They negotiated the right that the land will be distributed at a forward date based on a certain formula. But because that formula did not seek to go in line with the interest of the commercial class, again, we're still talking about commercial interest, they pooled the resources. The UK, the EU, and then eventually the United States sanctioned Zimbabwe. Why? Because they chose to take that land. They never thought Zimbabwe would go to that extent of taking the land, but it had already been done before. Again, those who fail to study history continue to make the mistakes of the past. Gaddafi did it in 1969 when he expelled Italians from Libya. It has been done before. And so the question is, just like what's his name? Just like Malema said, probably we need not change our voice. Speak to them as you want it to be done, so that they are clear that the moment they lose power, this is what they are giving up. So, I mean, for me, the world over can learn lessons everywhere. There is no society that is insular to the point where it cannot. Even human beings are not perfect. We tread, we trip. Sometimes my people will say, when you trip, it's not the fact that your face did not hit the ground. It is for you to look back and see what tripped you, so that you go back and remove that trip for making the path safe for somebody else coming behind you. So again, they are removing those stumbling blocks for us to learn. Because if in the first year they're able to gain 6% of the electoral vote in 1 year of formation, it goes to say, if you truly organize, you can make anything work. And if they came back the following election and went from 6 to 4%, that speaks volumes. So again, I think Brother Toure is right on that. And I still think that phrase should continue, that word should continue to be screamed from the rooftop. Organize, organize, organize.
Yeah.
But again, you have to learn from history. If you do not study your history, you will make the same mistakes of the past. So,
You mentioned not changing the message despite who we're talking to, and it reminds me, yes, of that part in the speech where Malema, the first thing this white man interviewer asks Malema or says is, you will be in the UK, you have been, and you will be in the next few days, talking to basically the top class of the UK. He calls them the heart of the English establishment, people who are different from the people you normally speak to in South Africa. And right there, classism, right? And as if to expect Malema to change his narrative because he's in front of them, as if they should be spoken to differently. And Malema perfectly responds and says, my message doesn't change because of who I'm talking to. And it shouldn't. Our message should not change because of who we're talking to, because then it will be misleading. And this is something I say all the time. When you code switch, when you change what you're saying, it doesn't come through and you lose your message. And I'm glad to hear Malema say that. How has the EFF inspired the youth in South Africa? I mean, we see stories. We know about the education movement. The youth in South Africa are pushing for free education. They're not giving up. No matter how long it takes, they're still pursuing it. We know that they have joined their parents, as he says in the speech, to fight for their parents' rights and benefits in these companies that are hiring them and not paying benefits to them. So, Brother Allimadi, how has the EFF inspired the youth outside of South Africa?
Well, first in South Africa, as you asked the original question, I think it's similar to what Steve Biko was able to do with the Black consciousness movement, because he said prior to that, the Black agenda or issues that affected Black students, for example, in all the universities and the youth, their spokespersons were the national students organizations that were dominated by European South Africans, right? So the African youth developed an inferiority complex that they always needed people to speak on their behalf, on their issues. But when Steve Biko told them that, no, you can actually speak for yourself, and this is how you do it, and formed an organization to represent their interest, and started writing essays, and eventually published it as a book, I Write What I Like. That
Exactly.
radicalized the youth, it inspired the youth, and as he explains in that short interview of 24 minutes that I mentioned earlier, it lifted that sense of inferiority complex. They were now in charge of their own affairs. They were leading the agitation on their behalf. They became much more bold. They were no longer afraid of the security forces and confronted them head on. And unfortunately, the security forces also, of course, responded with mass violence, including the Soweto massacre. But things were never the same after that in South Africa. It really focused South Africa on the path toward the end of apartheid. So I think now you have EFFs playing sort of the similar role to what Biko and Black consciousness did in the earlier generation. And he's saying that no, just because we now have the ANC, and it's true, they spearheaded the struggle against apartheid, we shouldn't be content now that they've become conservative. They're no longer agitating for the issues that affect the working class, the marginalized, the mine workers, the ones that are still dispossessed from the land. And you can do it for yourself. There's need for another movement to agitate for those issues if the ANC isn't doing it. So that's how I compare what the EFF has been able to accomplish in South Africa. And then in terms of the rest of the continent. And this is where social media really plays a tremendous role. Young people throughout the African continent have been following what the EFF has done in South Africa. And as a result, we now see young people forming political parties throughout the continent. In fact, it is young people that are at the forefront of the resistance against French colonial rule. And I call it colonial rule because the French don't play games around it. They don't pretend that, oh, we now have Africans that can act as our neo-colonial agents. The French still have troops, thousands of troops deployed in several African countries. The French still control the currencies of several African countries. So the youth are at the forefront of displacing this type of French colonialism in West Africa, including in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and other West African countries, even Senegal. And they're getting tremendous inspiration from the EFF of South Africa. Back to you, sister. I think you're muted.
I am muted. I'll stop doing that. Brother Adesoji, how has the EFF influenced the youth outside of South Africa?
Oh, well, you just need to look at Senegal at the moment. The youths are out in the streets challenging the government of, his name escapes me now, the incumbent government in in Senegal. Why? Because sometimes you just need to be faced with some of the most absurd situations to realize there is somebody not quite doing their job. Can you imagine in a country that is surrounded by water, fish is more expensive than beef? I mean, just it's ridiculous, but
is that possibly because they're not buying fish that's coming from there?
It's not because they're not buying fish. It's because the fish has essentially been outsourced.
Thank you. Yes.
To deep trawler firms who for them the notion of selling it in Senegal is not one that they're quite willing to accept. So they rather freeze it and take it overseas. So the little fish that you have lots of people struggling to get them. And then you can't go out and farm fish in your own waters because the government has effectively sold the rights to a foreign agent. And so that's not the only case. The case is when it comes to political representation, the government is also telling you that this guy that you pin your hopes on is not the one for you. Why is that? Because in 2026, okay, I'll preface that with this. Mali and Burkina Faso are currently in talks to constitute an economic federation. And as such, they're looking to Senegal to contribute to bring Senegal into the fold. That would mean 3 of the largest, if not most, economically powered countries in French-speaking countries, I shudder, to come together, share a resource, share currency, and political union, and that is scaring the French. Because it means if Senegal were to fold, Senegal is taking with them gas and oil reserves that's just been discovered off the shores of Senegal, and oil deposits as well that has just been discovered in Burkina Faso. And we all know what the Europeans are going through now with their troubles against Russia. And so a brother in the chat asked me, and it's just going along with what I'm about to say, that is there an organization that, no, they're actually in the streets. It's a people-led revolution. It's not, they're not fighting under the cover of anyone. They're literally in the streets, street by street, road by road, quarter by quarter. So Some might say, oh, well, it's organized. No, it is spontaneous. People are simply fed up. And so, where am I going with this? The inspiration came from the concept that what happened in Soweto in 76 can happen, leading to the understanding that the apartheid regime and its actions are untenable. People have come to the conclusion that the more they are in the streets and people are asking, why are these people in the streets? Eventually, power will be conceded. And yes, power will be conceded eventually. Because I can tell you what, when push comes to shove, power often gives up because it knows, listen, there's so many people you can pop in the streets before it becomes untenable, even to those who are backing you. And so, yes, inspiration can be found. So many. I mean, another one would be the pipeline in Uganda.
Mm.
The pushback against it actually stems from people seeing what has been done in Mozambique. Again, a youth led pushback against French interest. Now, to think after all that has transpired in Europe in terms of climate change and what have you, you want to build a pipeline through virgin territory across multiple countries so that you can take a resource. I mean, it beggars belief. It beggars belief. But hey, this is commerce. This is commercial interest again, as we say.
Yeah, over people's well-being.
True.
Again, capitalism. And Malema does address capitalism, and we'll speak more about him as we speak about the apartheid history and the plan of the EFF. My um, research pleasantly revealed to me that the EFF is extending outside of the South African borders, which is something I was very happy to see. So there are branches of the EFF in Botswana, Liberia, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and unofficial ones in Nigeria, Malawi, and the DRC. Official ones in Botswana, Liberia, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, with the one in Namibia actually having had 2 seats won in parliament in 2019. So this movement is becoming infectious, and I hope it does become even more infectious because it is a Pan-African movement. And hopefully the brothers and sisters in Senegal learn about this and start organizing officially and in a more structured way to address the issues they have. Because I believe if we as Africans unite, because we face the same issues, even in the US, as you tell the story, Brother Allimadi, of South Africa, it's reminding me of the US, the people with no benefits who go to work every day and have nothing to show after so many years of working for an organization. So if you are an African sitting somewhere thinking you're special and you cannot unite with others, I am asking you to awaken from your stupor and realize that you will be oppressed forever if you continue with that mindset. The apartheid history. Let's get into that because Malema is very, very clear about this. And I like that he speaks for himself. You don't have to go and ask anyone what the EFF thinks. You just go to the EFF and they'll let you know what they think. How is Malema hoping to handle apartheid history? And how are they currently handling apartheid history, the EFF? And we speak of Malema because he is leading them, but they are working as a community, and he is very keen to introduce his comrades when he goes to places to speak. So, how are the EFF handling the apartheid history?
Well, I don't think apartheid is actually history yet. Apartheid was really just another word for the same type of system that dominates the world, finance capital. What was apartheid after all? Apartheid was the segregation of the non European population into marginalized, low standards of living, right? So that they're dependent on providing their labor to sustain the system through the farms, working essentially. Uh, you could see them essentially like the enslaved Africans worked the southern plantations, right?
Yeah,
Working in the European
chain
farms,
gangs. Yeah, chain gangs. Yeah.
working in the mines.
Mm.
In fact, they were, in fact, like lived in slave-like conditions because the men
Camps.
to live away from their families on hostels
Hmm.
while they were on contract with these mines. So they would not even see their families for a whole year.
I remember
Right?
reading Mine Boy as we were growing up. There's a book about
That's
that.
right.
Mine Boy.
Yeah, living like in cell-like blocks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like prisons, and then seeing their families for maybe a week or two at the end of the contract, and then coming back to, And so they call theirs apartheid, right? But that condition existed in the United States and other industrialized countries. And that system is still, to a very large extent, very much intact in South Africa. So it's a living legacy. And that is the system that the EFF is fighting in South Africa. And that is the system that the youth that Brother Adesoji was talking about are fighting in West Africa and other parts of Africa. So Adesoji mentioned a few issues which are critical. The issue of the currency. It is the attempt to form an independent African currency that got Muammar Gaddafi killed in Libya. It was because Gaddafi had set aside billions of dollars, $7 billion, to support an African currency, a new currency that would relieve the West African countries initially first, and then the rest of the continent on dependence on the former European colonial powers. So that's a critical thing, and that's why the French are very keen on what is happening amongst those three countries that Adesoji mentioned. What I also like about the EFF is that they have inspired rebelliousness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because our young people are sometimes too accommodating. And that is not only a critique of youth in African countries, but even here in the United States. My students at John Jay, when they complain about the tuition, and I tell them the story of what young people did in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Roads must fall. And they watch the Malema lecture, and we discuss that. And I say, well, let me see some hands up. How many of you are organizing protests? There's not a single hand up. I said, and why are you not organizing protests? Don't you see yourself as capable of influencing and affecting change? How come young people were doing this in the 1960s? Young college students were going to protest in the South against your own form of apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
Now you guys are just busy posting your photos on Instagram and on other social media places. You can do both. You can do that while fight for the issues that impact you directly as well. The other thing I like about the EFF is that Malema is criticizing dictatorship
Mm-hmm.
and corruption in other African countries, which is what we must do. We must not say that this is an issue for South Africa alone, this is an issue for Kenya alone, issue for Nigeria alone, issue for Uganda alone. No, they're so common and pervasive issues that it shows to you that they come from the same type of origin. Where we have the industrialized countries, particularly the United States, imposing and sustaining these uh, these despots in many African countries because they serve the interests of the West. So I like the fact that he was very critical of them and saying, no, we must not allow them to take over the national treasury and turn it into a personal belonging and to practice nepotism. And this critique to me was very inspiring because it reminds me of the same critique that Walter Rodney had in crisis in the periphery, Africa and the Caribbean. And he outlines a similar thing. So we have the post-colonial leadership, you know, elected, they come there and then they say, oh, we don't need any more elections, right? The big man knows best. And then the elections that they conduct are referendums to see if people want to ever hold elections again. And the resounding response is always, no, we no longer want any more elections.
We believe in you.
And then, of course, only 5 to 10% of people vote in those referendums. So those are the type of critiques that we need much more of. And then also, what I like about the EFF, and also I tie once again to Rodney's lecture, Crisis in the Periphery. We cannot have effective solutions if the parties that are forming the governments in most African countries are a reflection of the parties in the former colonial powers. See? Many of those parties, they may have African sounding names. The structures are the same. The way that the officers are designated, the responsibilities and obligations of the officers, very similar to the parties that rule in the former colonial countries that colonized them. So how would they be able to push for the interest of working people in African countries? So I like the fact that they're changing the very nature of the parties that govern in African countries, or that should govern in other African countries. And that should also be another lesson, not only for other African countries, but as I said in the very beginning, even for people here in the United States. Young people in this country should become much more proactive, take advantage of social media engagement to start discussions into forming parties who represent the interest of young people and working people, and have the leadership also be young people and working people.
There is when you say young people, and with the Rose Must Fall statue protests in what year was that? That was 2015, if I'm not mistaken.
What happened? I didn't hear the first thing.
The Rose Must Fall. It's 2015, isn't it?
The campaign, yeah.
Yeah. No, 2015, March 2015. It was thereabout, yeah. March 2015. Now, why is that important? That's important in the sense that you had young people who came out, and for one, they were not talking about what was trending. They were actually talking about the joys of learning, education. Why is that stinging? That was stinging in the sense that I was listening to NPR's report on the French summit between President Ruto of Kenya, Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, and Macron in the last week. And while they were giving the submission, Ramaphosa says, Mr. President, I think it would be very important if I am able to go back and tell my people that I have not only come here to France to listen, but I have come and understood that we are going to do things differently from how it has always been done before. I'm like, well, if you refuse to learn from history, then history will teach you a second time. There is nothing these guys are going to promise you that they will deliver on.
I mean, the first thing Adesoji is that he's asking. Like, why are you asking?
No, and he then made one statement. That was the statement that I said, listen, this guy is not serious. He said something that, and I knew it was his speechwriters that wrote it, because either he didn't know, or either he felt, well, it's okay to say it. He said, I would, as great men have done in the past, I would love to build a railway from the Cape to Cairo. I'm like, are you serious? Do you know what you just said? That was the words of Cecil Rhodes And when he was saying those words, he didn't say it to connect people. He was saying it so that they can exploit all the resources in the path of that railway and take it out through the Suez Canal. That was the reason for that statement. And so when you, a president in 2023, are echoing the sentiments of not just a racist, but a genocidal killer without, any umbrage, it shows that you do not read. And whoever wrote that speech also did not read. So imagine we're talking about education, quality education. If you had quality education, you would not make that statement. You would not make that statement. And then for him to pat himself on the back to say, well, when I get back home, at least I will tell them we have come here, we have talked, and we have listened. Now we wait for what the next line of action would be. You can't make this stuff up. You just can't make this stuff up. It is skin crawling to even hear him make that statement. I was like, what?
Yeah, but brother, I'm surprised that you're surprised.
Mhm.
This is a guy who stitched $4 million in a sofa.
It appears to be a cycle of surprises.
So which
but
means
let's go on.
instead of him using some of that money to buy books, he stitched it into his
a
sofa.
guy who stitched $4 million.
But you
I
say
don't
you
see liberation is coming from a Cyril Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa is not, the Ramaphosa today is not the Ramaphosa of the trade union leadership of COSATU when he was at the forefront of the trade union movement in South Africa, fighting against apartheid. He was a hero to working class in South Africa and around the world. But if you are able to put $4 million in a sofa, it means you have, in fact, he's a billionaire, not by South African rands, but he's a billionaire in United States dollars. And that was one sofa that was discovered. And the guy does not have only one sofa, right?
not one mansion either. So
So even that's why it's actually even much more important that we have a party like the EFF. First of all, these African leaders should not be going to have any meeting in France.
right.
They were having that meeting because they were either on their way to or from Ukraine and Russia. And why did they go there? They went there because they want these two parties, not really two parties, because it's Russia versus NATO, really, and the United States. Anyway, they want this war resolved so that normal commerce can resume, the cost of food should decline. Another revelation of their failure as African leaders. Why are you importing $35 billion worth of food from outside Africa to feed Africans when Africans were one of the first people to farm the land, when Africans were taken into the New World to farm the land and teach the skills of farming? And now you're importing $35 billion of food? Those are the questions you need to answer. And some of the answers are this: you are kicking people off the land and giving the land to so-called investors who are promoted by the IMF and the World Bank. Number one. Number two, you're not vigorously pushing to redistribute the land in countries like South Africa, Namibia, and even Kenya, right? Number three, you are not promoting agricultural entrepreneurship, commercial agriculture for the African youth who are languishing in the streets, in the urban areas, in various African countries. Youth with tremendous potential who have no opportunities And what are they doing as a last resort? They're drowning as they try to cross the Mediterranean to make it to Europe so they can clean the toilets, work in the kitchens, sweep the streets, or work in those farms in southern Italy. It is really mind-boggling. We have to always make this connection so that when people see them dressed in these nice suits and ties and meeting with the Macrons and talking all this nonsense, we remind them and we shame them that you are there because you failed to do all these things to deliver for Africans.
A few things that you both said that are inspiring a lot of thought in my head. I'll start with the education. So he talks about Malema in this speech talks about having while he was in the UK at that time, having a conversation with one of the captains of the exploitative system, right? That's what he calls them. I love that he calls them that. He throws a lot of shade while being speaking well. And he says that this gentleman comes to Malema and says, well, you see this thing about you all asking for free education. If we educate everyone and everyone is educated, we're going to take away the population that provides cheap labor. There'll be no cheap labor available. And Malema says, okay, fine, you're right. Okay, we need cheap labor, right? How about you volunteer your son to be the one who doesn't go to school and he provides that cheap labor? And he says immediately, this gentleman's like, no, we're not doing that. And this is about putting ourselves in other people's shoes, right? Capitalists are not very good at that. It's all about them, and their community. They have a very tight-knit community of capitalists. They stay strong and together so that they can sustain that system. But we, as the ones oppressed under it, are divided instead of uniting so that we can fight it. So for me, as you speak about education, Adesoji, as you were talking about President Ramaphosa not being educated, which is why he would make a statement like that. It is not enough to be educated, because one could read all the books in the world but still come out as an idiot who does not know how to act accordingly. And these are people who've gone to schools. These are people whose parents have paid a good amount of money to take them to some of the best schools. But as you can see, they're not using the education that they got. So it's not only for us to use education or books. And first of all, let's not forget that the education system as it is a colonized system that is intentionally meant to keep us from rising and knowing better. Not only are we to read the books and learn about the history, but we are to take action from what we read. And we are to build systems that are better. We are to learn from both the success and the mistakes of those who came before us, so that we can implement the successes and do better on them, but also avoid the mistakes. So my point is that all strategies should be put at the table, and we should look at all of them, including the uneducated, because the uneducated have the street smarts. And those are the people we are trying to talk to. Those are the people in the village who we hope will listen to the message and rise against the oppressive systems. The other thing he talks about is the South African government being pressured by the US, right? And they're given 60 days to respond because they have rejected the low-grade food from the US. And they respond in 10 days under the pressure, and they invite low-grade food into South Africa. This goes back to them traveling to France. And they start with saying that we are not here to beg, yet they are literally begging as they say we are not here to beg. You're there to ask for food as if you don't have land in Africa that can provide food. So instead of these African presidents having a conference together, meeting up and starting to strategize on how Africa is going to produce food, they get in a plane, a very expensive one, to go to France to beg while they're saying they're not begging, and then to sign agreements of the low produce, the low quality produce and products from the US, from China, from elsewhere, to be brought into Africa, killing business in Africa, killing the economy in Africa, killing the people in Africa, because this is low quality food. So we as Africans need to stop looking at the shiny object, which is these people standing up, and we get videos of them speaking up against the West when their actions is not showing what they're saying. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything before we move over to
I mean,
pan-Africanism.
it speaks to the restoration of Africans' dignity when Brother Milton said, not only do these kids struggle to get across the Mediterranean, but also then start picking up fruits or whatever produce in the south of Italy. Only last week, about 600 people died off in the Adriatic Sea, just off the shores of Greece, because apparently now it is almost criminal for you to aid anyone who is in distress. Tearing up the law of the sea, which is when you're in distress, whatever, even if it's the enemy, you help them. But that's not the point. The point is the fact that these kids have left places like Zimbabwe, places like Libya, places like Zambia, places like South Africa, Namibia, Burkina Faso, and obviously Kenya, Djibouti. Why? Because one, all of them don't have access to land. In the case of Djibouti, it's almost you have to die fighting for your country, because they have this rule that once you're 18, you become signed up to military service. And that military service is open ended. So these kids want a better life for themselves, escape, only to then go and sell themselves literally into economic slavery. Why? Because the land that should be theirs, I mean, these countries are independent, at least on paper. They are independent. So talk about the dignity of agency, that you cannot even decide what it is you're going to do with said land. And some of these lands are so fertile that sometimes you don't even need to work the land. You just need to toss a seed onto it and go about your merry way. Come back in the stipulated time, and the land will yield. The land will literally yield. But instead, these governments are playing footsie with the lives of their population. And here's the scary part: Africa has a growing population, largely between the age of 18 and 35, constitutes over 60% of the population of Africa. So if you unsettle that kind of population, you have a living disaster on your hands. So again, the call is on the youths to, start organizing. You have a model. Yeah. You don't necessarily have to start big. Sometimes it's just start with one, center yourself around one key policy. If it's simply education for all, free education for all, let that be your motto. Just take one. You don't need to fill your entire manifesto with 20 programs. Just one. Free education. That's all. Free education from childbirth to university. If that is your goal, just make that your goal in clear and simple language. When we get into power, this is what we're angling for. And as they say, all politics is local. Start locally. Organize. And going back to the issue of food, I'll just say this last word. Thomas Sankara will often say, if you want to know what imperialism looks like, just look on your plate. If you don't produce that food, you might as well resign yourself to everything coming. And like he said, again, he who feeds you controls you. So when Ramaphosa jumped at the behest of the Americans, saying, bring whatever it is you want. You eventually, you've signed yourself off to food imperialism, and that's it. You're done.
Yeah.
You're done.
So I want to jump into a couple of questions, but before we do that, let's talk quickly
Before we go
about,
into questions, I have
yeah.
1 minute. Yes.
But as you say that, so that you can answer both, say what you're saying and answer this, Pan-Africanism and the EFF. But go on, brother.
All right. So in terms of the system wanting to have a class of uneducated as cogs for the system, that's not unique, of course, to South Africa or to African countries. We just saw the killing of affirmative action by the Supreme Court of the United States.
Thank you for making
So
the
that
connection.
should provide a parallel lesson, and they somehow see this as the people that supported that killing of affirmative action education. They see this as some sort of victory. And obviously, the only people that can see that as a victory are the ones that want a whole class to be kept at a certain level. So I just wanted to draw that parallel system.
But as you draw that quickly, Allimadi, and it's sorry that I have to jump in there, but as you draw that, it is upon us now to take to determine for ourselves what we're going to do about educating our masses, right? We have to take education into our own hands. Go on, brother.
And then the second point I wanted to make was that some of the struggle African countries cannot do individually. So to fight the World Trade Organization, to fight the World Bank, to fight the IMF, it's going to take a conglomeration of African countries together. And as Thomas Sankara said, let's renounce the debt collectively. If I do it alone, I won't be alive next year. He was dead in 3 months. So that's the second point. Some of these things they can't fight as individual weak countries. And then finally, what they can do is what the EFF is doing. The EFF may not yet be in a position to fight the World Bank, but they can put enough pressure on their domestic governments that we can't have business as usual while you are caretaging to the needs of the World Bank and IMF. We're going to make this a living hell for you, so that you have to listen to the demands of our people, whether it's on land, whether it's on health, whether it's on education. So the new parties can push for that, not the co-opted old parties that are part of the power structure and part of the problem. So I just wanted to make those points.
Adesoji, the EFF and Pan-Africanism. Did you want to say something about Pan-Africanism, Allimadi, before we move on to brother?
Well, the EFF has called for a borderless Africa. That's as
Thank
Pan-African as you can get.
We can't stress the point. He did when the issue of anti-African protests started in South Africa. Brother Julius Malema was at the forefront of saying, you're not angry about the Europeans, but you're angry about people who look like you. And so Africans should not be asked to carry a passport, because in his inimical way, he said, we have always been here. We are part of the soil. We can go anywhere. And it is only people of African descent that somehow create minimal, to use the words of Ayikuyama, tiny plantations. And we've locked ourselves in with pass cards, posing as passports, saying, oh, I am this, I am that, instead of thinking of themselves as African. So yes, they are very Pan-Africanist. But the question is, people are often scared of, and which brings me to this, people are often scared when they hear the term Pan-Africanism. What does it mean? Well, in layman terms, I mean, we could do the academic side of it, but in layman terms, it's simply Africans see themselves in each other wherever it is they are, and tie themselves toward working in their own best interest. You could speak a language and then identify with those people that come from that language. But when you're faced with a common adversary or threat, you unify and act accordingly. That is it in plain, simple terms. It's not wishy-washy. Oh, my race or my language or my culture is going to be expunged from the world if I walk with this. Like, that is so ridiculous beyond measure. It is, I mean, it's asinine to even think.
But it's funny, Adesoji, as you say that, these people who claim that do not have any problem with English taking over their culture. They have no problem with Western ways taking over their culture. They have no problem with Western culture taking off because they're welcoming it. You don't hear them fighting Western culture as they fight the idea of Kiswahili being the unifying language in Africa, the idea of Pan-Africanism. They don't fight that, but they want to. They don't fight Western culture coming into Africa, but they want to fight the idea of Africa uniting. Malema and the EFF, he says that the EFF wants Africa to have a common agenda and a common purpose, to unite and reclaim its lands and resources. The EFF's goal, which they want to spread all around Africa, is economic freedom, for Africa to finally have a say. And he speaks about this. If we are going to invite the West, the US, China, and all other foreign, and he does speak about China as well, other foreign entities, it is on our terms as Africans and not terms influenced by them, terms based on our African ways of thinking and the well-being of Africans. We have Brother Dwayne Nichols. He asked, can the Green Party take on the concerns that the EFF does, or do we need a new one? I'm guessing this is in the US, yes.
I think
Brothers.
the EFF, I mean, the Green Party is a segment. It's a party that represents a segment of the multitude of issues that need to be confronted. So I would see the Green Party as a part of that national conversation that needs to happen in order to form this this essentially progressive party, not progressive in name only, because anybody can call themselves progressive. But by progressive, you would have an action plan for education, for housing, for how the armed forces should be deployed, and for what purposes, for how police forces should be deployed, and for what purposes, on the pay inequity between CEOs of corporations and workers. You know, it's preposterous. If you look at the differential, you know, where you have CEOs making several hundreds of times more than the workers who are actually producing the wealth.
Yep.
That to me would actually be the number one agenda, because once you address that issue, then it can impact and affect all other issues. Because if you have income much more distributed in a more equitable way, people can take care of themselves much, much more better. But now, as I go back to this comment that I made on this show as well, and on every show that I've appeared on, this wealthy friend. And people wonder, oh, if you have this wealthy friend, how come you're not wealthy? Well, sometimes friends are only for sharing ideas.
And also they don't share. They're capitalists. Right. They don't share with their friends.
But this billionaire said, Milton, and I repeat it, I'm sure I've said it on one of our episodes before, we will have social uprisings and possibly a revolution in the United States. Yeah. And I asked him, why do you say this? He said, because when I started making my wealth, there was a middle class in the United States. Today, there's only people like him and everybody else. This system is unsustainable. They think they can use the armed forces and the police to suppress it. When the uprisings begin, it's not going to work, believe me. This is a billionaire saying it. Think about it, right? So these are the issues that need to be addressed. And these issues are not going to be addressed by the Republican Party. Mm-mm. They're definitely not going to be addressed by the Democratic Party, neither. Because their senators, the members of the House who are members of the Democratic Party, also owe their being elected to contributions from the very wealthy. So how are they going to go there and cut off their own throat? It won't happen. And that is why before, there are two ways. Either this party I'm talking about emerges in the United States, or the United States might experience what this billionaire is
Was
telling me
predicting.
unsolicited. We are having a conversation. I don't even remember on what topic. And a billionaire offers this information to me. I didn't say, oh, what do you think about the economic or political conditions in the US? No, I didn't ask. We were sitting talking about something else, and he says, Milton, listen to me. And he tells me what I just shared. Think about that.
And as much as brother Conte is how we say that, Silly. As much as I don't want to entertain this question, not against you, brother, but just because of the ridiculousness of this issue. Brothers, as you can see, how do you all feel about Dr. Cornel West potentially running as a third-party candidate with the Green Party? Here we are in a public platform. These questions will come. We need to
he's
respond.
A candidate. He's declared his candidacy already.
How do you feel about it?
I think he will talk about some of the issues that we discuss on a regular basis on this show. So if he can get enough media coverage, then obviously he will have a platform to articulate these issues that impact the working class and many of the marginalized communities. So in that sense, it will be good. It will be a good way to actually talk about the need to launch a party that is not dominated by the Republican donors and the Democratic donors. I hope he makes that one of the issues that he talks about on every campaign appearance that he makes.
Adesoji.
I would say the idea at this point in time, this is excuse me. African Americans are facing an existential threat of the return of fascism.
Yep.
No matter how articulate you are, when someone holds a determined position, I don't think it's your nuance, your elocution, the way you pronounce words that will help you. No. These people are determined to seize power, and all they understand is power. If you get in the way of the other side, that is the side that is seeking to survive, just survive, oh my God, it's almost like they've won the lottery. You saw what happened with the affirmative action. Now imagine if one of those judges on the Democratic side or who have left-leaning politics passes on. Guess who gets to pick the next one? You effectively lock down the Supreme Court, the judges that will come in. You already have states where the Democratic governor is facing a what's the term again? A supermajority in the House. So effectively, any law that he feels that they pass, although he can veto it, they can still throw it back to him. Consider this. So I think there is time for being eccentric. I'm sorry, but this is not the time. This is not the time. You articulate, you have enough platforms to voice whatever you think is deserving of the people you claim to represent. But putting it in the course of having what's the word? Of having a conversation that is just between do we survive or not survive? At this moment in time, is not for someone to come in the middle and say, oh, by the way, if you open the window, if you look out, you can see trees waving. And nah, I'm sorry, no.
Brother, I'm going to throw quickly, and I know it's already time, but here we are. I'm going to throw a question at you. What is the right time to do so?
The right time to do so. I'm not saying you can't speak anytime. When someone is pointing a gun and aiming a gun at you, it's not the time to tell me how beautiful the lilies are. It's really not. Don't care how poetic you are. That's not the time to tell me how, oh, if you look, oh, how you lay your eyes. Nah, we're docking first and then hopefully shooting back. Now is not the time for that. It's not.
All right, sister, there's one question, if we have time, I actually
Where?
like to
Which one? You can highlight it, Brother Allimadi, if you
the
see it.
land, the land issue, whether the EFF has experienced. It's a question that somebody, Langston, asked on
Just click on it. It's going to come on the screen.
the Zimbabwean friend. What policy considerations or track record does Julius or the EFF have that makes the panelists think Julius can effectively administer land reform in South Africa?
Right. Okay.
Will it just be another into things Zimbabwe? Well, I think that is actually not the correct question to be posing. That is the question that the ones that are currently hoarding the land should be much more concerned and worried about than the people that are deprived of the land. I don't think the burden should be turned on the victims. The burden should be turned on a people who, after 29 years since apartheid ended, are not coming together and saying, we as European South Africans that originally got this land by killing the ancestors of people like Malema, and we profited it for these centuries
And writing laws.
wealth in South Africa and overseas from this land. And 29 years, and there's been no revolution. Africans have not come violently to seize the land from us. In many parts of the world, if you have these type of conditions, there would have been a revolution involving even deaths of the people that have been historically exploiting. So they should be asking themselves, we enjoyed all this ill-gotten wealth for centuries. We've enjoyed it for another 3 decades after apartheid ended. Should we not be coming together amongst ourselves and saying, how should we create conditions that would allow this to be a much more just society and address the needs of the deprived Africans from the land? That is the question that the onus should be upon them. But if they don't address that issue, then later on they can't blame the consequences. Say, oh, look at how they did the redistribution. That is a false story. That is a story to divert from the real issue of the day, which was the same thing in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe never would have had to experience an haphazard land reform had it been done correctly. And the first proposal was for the British and the United States to provide the money to buy the land from the European Zimbabweans. The British reneged. So the US said, well, if the British are now backing off from that agreement, why should US taxpayers be paying? We were doing it just to help our British kith and kin. But if they're no longer interested, why should the US take the lead? And that was reasonable for the US to take that position. See? And now look at the ignominy of it all, the ultimate insult. Zimbabwe is now taking a $3 billion loan to compensate the Europeans from whom the land was seized, even though they stole the land and killed Africans in the process.
Can I just say this quickly?
I'm not saying, oh,
can I just
mess it up?
Exactly.
On the ones who are sitting on the land today.
Can I just add that?
Yes, sir.
That question again goes back to, it's an exploitative question, and one filled with so much rhetoric that sometimes when someone asks a question like that, you should ask, what's your motivation for asking the question? It's like when the American government wrote off tax rebates for the billionaires. How much was it? He added over $1 trillion onto the American debt.
Deficit, right.
Yeah. How much was the students' loan forgiveness? How much was it supposed to be? less than a billion, less than half a billion. And yet someone sued, effectively saying, you don't deserve this money. But we are paying you. We're giving you our money so that in future, people from our loins will pay for the money we've given you. Can you see how that mindset is so idiotic? You stole
I wouldn't say it's
parcels.
idiotic, but I think it comes
Thank
from
you.
the sense
You
that
be careful not to insult
No,
our
no, no.
community as they ask
we as
questions.
African
No,
people,
I'm not saying the person who asked the question. I'm saying the question in itself. The question in itself. The basis of the question is saying, okay, let's look at it from this point of view. The Dutch land,
I put the question on the screen just so that we get what is being asked. But
yeah,
go on.
the Dutch. Okay, so the Dutch landed in 1652. 1652 in South Africa. Yeah, by 1840, they had almost 80% of the land. Same thing in Zimbabwe, same thing in Zambia, same thing in Kenya, same thing in Libya. In Namibia, it was like, we're going to kill all of you to get it. We'll kill all of you to get that land. And so, policy considerations, those are flary words that don't need to be entering our lexicon. You want the land, get your land back. When you get your land back, if you decide you just want to lay on it and look at the stars, the discretion is yours.
right?
So here's my point, and as you were responding, Brother Allimadi, about Zimbabwe and calling the UK and the US to help them pay for the land, I am one of those Africans who is looking at my brothers and sisters and asking if they've lost their mind. This land was stolen from you. And Brother Malema says it in the speech. How do you pay land to people who got it through genocide? This is your land, they stole it. How are you paying them to get it back? He says, Brother Malema, he's not going to go about it through violence, but that land is being taken back by the Africans because it doesn't belong to you. And we've seen them on videos, Europeans crying, oh, this is the only home I know. Yes, we know that's the only home you know, but it was stolen. So it needs to go back to the rightful owners.
One point. We also be realistic and know that the minute land is seized, there are consequences.
Of course.
Which is why we should defend each other as Africans.
The living proof of that consequence.
Of course.
So that's an important point. And then the second point is that Langston actually added another post. He says he's not insulted by the question, by what Adesoji said, because it was not his question.
Mm-hmm.
No. I mean, like I said, it's not
the person who posed the question.
It's a painful.
It's a colonized mind.
Blackface.
It's a painful
blackface. But at the same time, it also comes from this position where Africans have been deprived historically for such a long time that sometimes unconsciously African people lower their standards of what their true value and worth and what they're entitled to is. You see? And that to me is the saddest part of it,
Yeah.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the part I will even say is this. In the last 3 weeks, 21 days, there has been 2 events in Kenya with regards to the very idea of land. One was women being abused, sexually abused on tea farms. Another one was a brother went into a farm to take a pineapple and was shot and burnt.
It's Delamere.
And burnt. So when someone then asks the question, what policy do you have? No.
And you do not see the West rising up and saying anything about that black African Kenyan who was shot because he was looking for food, right? Because food is so expensive right now in Kenya, speaking from first-hand experience.
In every African country.
Because they are bringing food from the West, because the West has decided, oh, we have products that don't meet the market here. Well, we can still make money out of them. Let's send them to Africa. We can still make a buck out of the bad product.
When a recent ancestor, show her name, show her face, that's Mr. Mugo, right? Wrote a book, this, with Ngugi wa Thiong'o. What were they doing? They were writing down the record so that not only do you not forget, but it acts as a living record of what you should not even be contemplating. What you should not even be contemplating. She's gone now. So the job is on us not to forget. It is on us not to forget.
And we have real letters in that book from members of the Kenyan land and freedom fighters. We have real letters showing how they were going about everything. We have mention of Dedan Kimathi and the leaders strategizing and responding strategically in the defense of their communities. So Brother Adesoji is right. Pick up that book and learn from it. And then we can take action.
One other thing before we go. Today would have been the 98th birthday, were he alive, of Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected president of Democratic Republic of Congo. He said this, and this was the last letter he wrote to his wife before he knew the time was coming. So the last letter he wrote to his wife is just a small tract. He said, history would one day have its say. It will be a history taught in the United Nations, Washington, Paris, or Brussels. However, the history taught in the country that have rid themselves of colonialism and its puppets, Africa will write its own history, and it will, both north and south of the Sahara, it will be a history full of glory and dignity. Speaking of dignity, the land is yours. Seek it, take it, and do whatever you want with it.
Yes.
Yes. Let me read this very quickly before
Thank you.
we sign off. A very good Tuesday afternoon, and many thanks for your email below. It is a pleasure to meet you and to learn of the impressive projects you're involved in. Please accept my compliment and appreciation for your contribution toward these critical areas of scholarship that require so much liberating, alternative knowledge. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, too, for your kind invitation to speak at the commemoration of the Battle of Adwa. Surely a historical milestone, and to participate in your radio show. Unfortunately, I will have to decline both due to health challenges from multiple myeloma. But with a caveat that, health permitting, I will be more than happy to consider joining you on the radio show at a future date. Hongera tena on your many achievements and all the very best in whatever you do. Warmly, Mishere Gitai Mogu, PhD. This was in response to the invitation for her to join us on Kumbukeni and on WBAI. Farewell, sister. And thank you for the email response.
Thank you. She's an ancestor now.
Yep.
That's it.
I think we close on that note. You all know where to find us. I will not interfere that connection with the spirit of Mishere Mugo. Or have a nice day, everyone. Asanteni.